All right. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for a status update on the Willamette Valley River Basin's water year. My name is Tom Conning. I'm a public affairs specialist for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Portland District. To minimize background noise during the briefings, please ensure you remain digitally muted. Please ask any questions within the WebEx chat function, and we may be able to take verbal questions at the end, depending on time and interest. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to call in. We appreciate your interest. And then everybody also, if you can, within the chat function, if you can do that, just give us a brief introduction of yourself, like we would normally during a public meeting, in-person meeting. This call is being recorded, and so we will be able to post it later if people want to go back and look at information. Today's call will include a brief overview of the Willamette Valley Project, its authorizations, and the current water year. Dustin Benson, the Deputy Operations and Project Manager for the Willamette Valley Project, will provide the overview of the system, and then Selena Hart, the Chief of Reservoir Regulation and Water Quality Section, will provide details about the water year. Once that update and overview are complete, we will open the call to questions. Dustin, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Tom. And Tom, just a quick check-in. Something that you may have in the background has got a bit of a gray block that is covering up part of the slides. Not exactly sure what that is, but I think in the past, there you go. Whatever you did was the right thing. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I really appreciate folks being here today, making the time in the middle of the day. I'm very encouraged, having been in the Willamette Valley for nearly 28 years now, to spread the largest turnout we've ever had at a water management meeting in the spring. I'm hoping that this forum, this thing we've learned to use so effectively over the last year, is a better way of communicating this information out to folks. And so looking for feedback on that as well and how this works for you. Today, our purpose and intent is to give you an update on where we are in the water year. I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have been watching very closely this spring and understand that we're in a difficult situation. I am also hopeful, having had some experience with this, that typically when we do water management meetings and we talk about drought, that is nature's cue to start raining like crazy. And I certainly hope that whatever we do today pushes some of that moisture our way, because we need it desperately right now. It's going to be a very challenging year if conditions don't change for us. Tom, you want to go ahead and advance the slide? I would draw everybody's attention to this picture just really quickly, I guess. This is our Willamette teacup diagram. I think a number of you have seen it over the years. It's a tremendous resource for you to get information on current water levels and flows. And at the end, we'll have some time, if needed, and can do a bit of a demonstration on it. But it really is the tool we want to focus people on to understand conditions out on our sites and what the forecast is bringing us. Okay, Tom, next slide. So, what I wanted to talk a little bit about, we'll focus mostly in on the forecast and storage, but I do want to talk about some of the things we have going on in the valley. It's been a very challenging year for all of us in a number of ways, and not just with the wildfire, and give you a sense of what we've got going on in the system. For the folks who have not been to one of these before, I'll do a very brief overview of our project. Tom referred to my role as the Deputy Operations Project Manager for the Willamette Valley Project and what that means. And then I'll turn it over to Selena Hart, who is in our water management section, and she will talk about forecast and some of the things that we have been doing over the course of the year to try to adapt to these really challenging conditions. And then at the end, as Tom mentioned, we'll have some time, I think, for questions and answers, and we'll be tracking stuff in the chat as well to try to shape our presentation as best we can. Go ahead, Tom. Next slide. So many of you, most of you probably are familiar with several or all of the projects, but the Willamette Valley Project consists of 13 multi-purpose dams. I'll talk in a second about what those dam purposes are and how they relate, especially in a year like this. But we have been operating dams since the early 40s. Our system recently commemorated 50 years in service back in 2019. And we're going through a lot of change with the Willamette Valley System, both in terms of reinvestment in our infrastructure and changes in how we operate currently to try to best balance and meet purposes downstream in the reservoir and adapt to issues around species recovery. So it is an interesting time, especially for me, having been here since 1993, to see how much change and how much pressure is on the system right now to continue to provide those purposes we've come to depend on. Tom, go ahead. Next slide. So when we talk about the project, most folks are familiar with the dams, but I do like to remind whenever I can that our project consists not only of the multi-purpose dams and then the 11 multi-purpose reservoirs and then the 2 deregulating projects that we have downstream of Detroit and Lookout Point. We also, as part of the project, have 5 mitigation fish hatcheries. The original authority had capacity for the navigation channel from Portland Harbor all the way to Corvallis. Willamette Falls Locks was a part and is considered a part of the Willamette Valley Project. We have hundreds of miles of revetments along the tributaries, and revetments meaning, rock. Typically, you'll see rock stabilizing banks along the Willamette River. All of these are aspects of the project as a whole, and a very complex system spanning, somewhere around 7,000 square miles and a big area. Tom, next slide. So our authorized project purposes, and I think everybody, especially after 2019, was refreshed on our flood risk management mission. That is our driving purpose. It's a pass-fail mission for us. I think we've described it as before. In April of 2019, in a 7-day span, we prevented nearly $2 billion of flood damages in the Willamette Valley in an event that was not enormous or super significant from a historical flood standpoint. But what we were able to do in operating the system dramatically decreased damages downstream. And I think that's a reminder, and I know that tends to come up in conservation years like this. When did you know it was going to be dry? What could have been done about it? And recall as we go through these slides and start looking at our refill curves that it was April of 2019 when we had that storm, right in the middle of what is typically our refill season, very late compared to where we've seen storms like that normally, and came upon us very quickly. So flood risk management is a huge driver for us. The population at risk downstream of our dams is very large, and so we have to be very cautious in how we manage that risk and try to refill reservoirs for all of these other purposes. Hydropower, mentioned navigation, our water quality benefits for fish and wildlife, but for drinking water supply as well. Downstream of our dams, we have authorities that allow for contracted irrigation of stored water for agriculture and for water supply for municipal and industrial uses. And then I think the majority and many people are here today to talk about recreation. Recreation is a huge benefit to the region and in the water that we store and the reservoirs we manage. But in addition to that benefit, we have the land that we manage around the reservoirs and a tremendous impact on the landscape from an environmental stewardship standpoint. All of these purposes are in tension, right, in balance. Once we start to store as much water as we'll have for the season, what we do and always do over the next several months until we get into the fall is try to figure out how to take advantage of what we have stored and provide the greatest benefit while meeting our legal requirements and other demands. Tom, next slide. So just something I wanted to mention up front, we have spent a lot of time over the last several years talking about our dam safety program and the evaluation of our dams, which is a constant and ongoing process for us. Our dams are in very good condition. They're very safe, but we are doing very detailed evaluations of our facilities, and specifically in some areas around the seismic hazards that we've all become more familiar with in the last 10 or more years. As part of that ongoing evaluation at several projects, we've implemented what are called interim risk reduction measures. Those typically look like restrictions in our normal conservation or summer high pool elevation so that we can, while we study and further define what that risk looks like and what the right measures are to mitigate for that risk. We're holding the schools down, taking a very conservative approach for public safety while we understand the impacts of a potential earthquake on our facilities. Now, in this year, and I think this is the important thing to realize in context for this discussion, those interim risk reduction measures really did not and are not affecting our storage this year. We simply haven't had the precipitation that we would normally expect, and we're not approaching those levels in a lot of areas. In a really abundant and wet spring, you will see us maybe discharging more water to maintain pool elevations consistent with those interim risk reduction measures. But that's not the case this year. I wish we had that problem this year, and unfortunately we've got the opposite problem. So I just wanted to let folks know this is ongoing. We'll have more communication as we get into fall about the rollout of what's called the National Inventory of Dams, which is a lot more accessible. I guess it makes information much more accessible to folks on the condition of our facilities and our emergency action plans and what we would do, what we're doing to maintain these structures in a safe way. Tom, next slide. So just a quick update on what our operational priorities. So I'm responsible for the operation and maintenance and the folks that operate and maintain our facilities. We are constantly focused in on security, our dam safety program, the reliability of our equipment, and environmental compliance, be it through releases of water or the fact that, we have potential risks of oil and other things in getting into the water system. And we have a very, very strong environmental compliance program. It's been a challenging year, both from the standpoint of COVID and doing our routine O&M responsibilities. And I'm really proud of our staff. I think folks should be aware that, throughout the pandemic and the pandemic response, we have had folks on site operating, maintaining, inspecting our facilities. That never stopped and never does stop. And our facilities remain ready for whatever comes at us this summer and into next winter. We are very focused on wildfire recovery. A number of our facilities were within the wildfire boundaries, and I think our infrastructure overall is in very good condition. We're focused on the impacts to the landscape around us and what those potential risks could be, both from a hydrology and runoff standpoint, as well as an access standpoint to our facilities. So lots of work going on this summer leading into next fall to try to continue to minimize risk to our facilities and make sure that our mission is not affected. I think a number of you know that we're very engaged in working through recovery for a number of listed species in the basin, both fish and terrestrial species. And so our compliance with our Endangered Species Act requirements under the biological opinion is ongoing, as well as, the reevaluation of that going into the future. And those actions certainly drive a number of our flow determinations. And in this year, early recognition of how difficult it was going to be, we cut back on flows, and that did two things. One, it helped us conserve water in a year that became increasingly more difficult, but it was something that is also in the best interest of our ESA-listed species to try to ensure that we have adequate or whatever water we can conserve to make releases and improve conditions downstream as we get into late summer and fall, which, if conditions don't change for us, will become increasingly difficult. That being said, we have some resource protection issues that are ongoing, especially around monitoring and protecting both natural and cultural resources. This is a very different year from that standpoint, and we're going to see areas of the project that are drier than they have been historically. It represents both a public safety and a resource protection risk. And I'm particularly concerned about people out and about in our lake beds, curious to see things that they've not seen before, but there will be risks out there from saturated soils and areas that we really don't and can't have a handle on until they show up. And so we're going to be actively working to get information out so that folks aren't down in those areas and exposing themselves to risk. That also goes hand in hand with a broader public safety message. We will have recreation opportunities at every project this year. There's low water boat access, and Selena will focus on critical elevations and what will be available and what won't. But it is going to have this constraining factor where more people are going to be concentrated into smaller pools. And then in any year, as the pool drops down, more and more hazards potentially come into play with regards to boating. And for a lot of boaters out on the water this year, they're going to see levels that they may not have seen before. And so folks really need to be cautious as they're out on the water, taking advantage of what we do have. But it is exposing some risks, and very concerned that we'll have accidents this year just based on the fact that we're going to see pool levels many of us or all of us haven't seen at this time of the year normally. So with that, I'm going to transition over to Selena so she can get into some of the specifics on where we're projecting pool levels to be, and both this summer and then into early fall. Selena?
Thanks, Dustin. All right, so going into the weather part of it, yeah, it's just been really dry. So on the left-hand side, we talk in water year. So our water year starts in October. So the precipitation from October until now has been really dry itself, in the 50-70% range. So it's been really dry this entire period. But when we talk about our reservoirs and when they refill, we start refill February 1st. So that's when we start doing that balance of flood risk management and refilling for the summer benefits. And so February came in, it was decent. We got some good amount of precipitation, but really that came as snow accumulation. So we had a good snowpack in the Willamette this year, which is great, but it's only a small portion of what really helps our reservoirs refill. So the precipitation we got came down in the snow, and then in March it was dry, April was dry, May has been dry. So it's just been this consistent dryness that we just haven't been able to shake. And, we talk about these last few years quite a bit. 2015 was a really dry year for us, and it hasn't really been that good since. We've had maybe one really kind of decent water year. The rest kind of been kind of average. But it hasn't really been, we haven't gotten that precipitation we really need to fill our reservoirs. And so I will be talking a lot about the last few years and comparing to 2015 and just kind of, because it's, a recent dryness that we had continuously, which does impact the following years. One dry previous year does result in impacts in the following years because our soil moisture is in a deficit and our stream flows are not, haven't regained their full amount of water. So it's just, we're just getting this, the back-to-back dryness, and this is, where we're at right now. Next slide. So this is, looking at the comparison of 2015 and this year. We looked at this last year the same way, and it's getting way drier. 2015 did not have the snowpack like we had this year, and that was that early on precipitation. We got a little bit more in February, but we are definitely drier than we were in 2015, and it looks like that's going to be our pattern moving forward. Next slide. So I talked about that snow accumulation. So we did come in, I think it was like 118% of average or something like that, much higher than our average. So that was good. But right now we're already seeing that most of the snow has melted. So the snow in our basin really helps that summertime inflow as our base flow, just keeps things, keeps us having some type of inflow. But with it already melted, most of it already melted, and knowing that the summer is going to get warmer, we're not going to be seeing a lot of increase in inflows from that snow melt, and it's really going to start getting lower and lower, and we're going to start seeing that inflow kind of top off soon. Go ahead. Next slide. Yeah, looking forward, our longer-term forecast is showing that we're going to be above normal temperatures and below normal precipitation. So that's not a good feeling for an already dry and kind of already seeing those warm temperatures. It did rain a little bit here in Portland. I do consider that because we're having this meeting right now that we got some rain, but there's still not enough rain to really do much for our reservoirs. We need that prolonged precipitation, our typical Northwest rain that we get tired of. That's the kind of rain we need this year, and we just didn't get it. So although any precipitation helps us, it's just not enough at this point. And our models do account for some, precipitation in the outlook, but so this is just not enough really to get us where we would like to be right now. Next. Okay. And then looking at the drought monitor, a lot of the counties have already declared a drought emergency. And I was looking at this last year. We are our worst off this year than we were last year. We have, every county in our state and even surrounding our state, there's just drought declarations all over the place. So it's dry everywhere you look right now. It's just driving it home how dry it really is this year. Next. So a lot of words here, but really the point is here is as Dustin had mentioned, we have downstream flow requirements, either defined by our House Document 531, our authorizing document, or from the 2008 biological opinion. And the biological opinion defines certain releases that we must do from the projects for the ESA listed species. During really dry years, we have the ability to shape our flows based on the available storage that we have. So it's a lot of adaptive management. We work really closely with our partner agencies to develop the best release plan to support temperature operations and downstream flow targets. And so we have done a lot of adjusting, doing our adaptive management early on in the year, as Dustin said. We reduced having main stem flow targets, which usually would pull a lot of water from our reservoirs. And by doing that, we were able to conserve that water. So our reservoirs were able to store that water, and they're much fuller than they would have been otherwise. And so that we'll have to use that. We'll be using that water later on in the summer when temperatures get much warmer and the natural rivers recede, that we'll be able to use our stored water to supplement the rivers downstream and keep things from getting much more dire than they would be. We also adjusted some flows on the north and south Sandy Am, so those improved the refill so that we could have that water for temperature operations at Detroit and also provide that water for later on in the season. And the other thing that we are looking at this year is potentially using our power pool. It's just a band of water that's below our normal minimum conservation pool. Within that elevation, that water is primarily for power production. So the intent is to draft into that so that we can use that water for the ESA listed species. But the intent is to continue being able to produce power. As long as we're within that band and not below that band, there's no impact to actual hydropower production. Next. All right, so we're going to get into the models. I don't believe I have a way to use my cursor, but maybe Tom can help out with his. Yeah, the left-hand side, that graph right there, we just call that the stacked graph. Just trying to look at what the last few years have looked like. That black line that's in both those graphs, that shape, that's our rule curve. That's essentially our line where we're balancing our flood risk management and the conservation season benefits. If we're above that line, that's usually we're doing some type of flood operation. We're storing water to release later after a flood has occurred. And then if we're underneath it, that's our conservation storage. So if we're not on that line, usually it's because the hydrology has not allowed us to maintain that much storage. So looking on the left-hand, where Tom is looking, the left-hand side is the elevations, and then the bottom is the dates, and then each line is a different water year. And so right now, the blue line is the water year 21. It kind of ends right now. We are below where we were in the last 6 years. So 2015 being the really dry year that we talk about, we were higher then than we are right now. And that's kind of common looking through all these graphs. We are lower in most of the reservoirs than we were in 2015. And before 2015, we talked about 2001 being our really dry year. So having a 2015 followed by a 2021 dry year, it's hard to think about having that many back-to-back dry years this dry. Okay, so looking on the right-hand side, this is our forecasted model. So that line right there, that right next to where the cursor was, that is the time that the model was ran. So that was yesterday. So anything to the left of that was our actual reservoir elevation, and to the right of it is our forecasted reservoir elevation. And to make things easier to communicate, the pink line is our 25% non-exceedance. Essentially, the 25% of our period of record, 25% of the years, we would see at least that elevation. So we're looking at the drier years, and that's what our forecast is based off. So we're predicting that we would be about 1474.5 feet on Labor Day. So we're going to use the pink line to predict what our forecast is, and then the black lines above and below, kind of our error bounds. There's a lot of uncertainty with this forecast. There's a lot that goes into it. We have our Northwest is hard to predict what the weather is going to be throughout the season. We just know it's going to be dry. And so there is a lot of uncertainty. We update these models frequently. We update them at least probably weekly. The water supply volume forecast itself gets updated daily. So technically, if we updated this daily, it would change daily, even if our flow plan is not changing. So we do communicate this out with our partner agencies every 2 weeks what our forecast is. So if you are not on any of our flow management meetings, if you're not a member of the public, you can get on those meetings. Otherwise, you can contact one of us, and we could provide you with some updated forecasts if needed. So each of these graphs have noted what the boat ramp elevations are. And so if you wanted to be able to look to see what boat ramps are available, looking at this forecast, you can see the elevation to the left and then the corresponding boat ramp elevation or boat ramp name. If it's bold, that means it's available during Labor Day. If it's not, that means the reservoir does not, is already too low to be able to access that boat ramp. So like at Bingham, the elevation is 1520. We don't even reach elevation 1520 at Hills Creek this year because it's just so dry. So we won't even see that elevation at all. And then 1507 looks like we're going to reach 1507, where we are already at that, but we won't be there for much longer, and then it will draft. But we do have a lot of low-level boat ramps at most of our reservoirs. So here we have 1441 Packard boat ramp. So that should be available throughout the season. So each of these graphs are the following projects are laid out the same way. We're looking at, I'll have the boat ramp information and the corresponding elevations for each project. And so right now, Hills Creek, Hills Creek, we're releasing about our minimums right now, and we'll plan on using a little bit of water for augmenting main stem flows as needed, and primarily in late May and June. And so we'll see that reservoir continuing to draft as we're releasing that water for the summer use. Okay, go ahead, Tom. All right, so Lookout Point is also on the Middle Fork. It's just below Hills Creek, so the water from Hills Creek then flows into Lookout Point's reservoir. So you can see on the left-hand side, we are we are a little better off than we were in 2015, but we are lower than the other years within that period. And similarly, our forecast is showing that we will be peaking sometime in June, and as we are releasing that water for the main stem, and as inflows start to recede, we will be drafting that reservoir pretty hard, as we typically do. This project gets used a lot for supporting main stem flows, and looks like most of the boat ramps will not be available, but we do have a low-level boat ramp at Signal Point that will be available throughout the season. Let's continue. All right, Fall Creek, looking on the left, we were kind of following along with the previous water years, and has since started to draft quite a bit as inflows are receding, and it looks like we're on the same trajectory as we were in 2015. We are releasing minimum flows for the fish facility just downstream of the dam, and it shows a pretty steady draft with most boat ramps unavailable, except for we do have a low-level boat ramp at North Shore that should be accessible for most of the season, if not all. Good. And then Cottage Grove, we've been following the rule curve for most of this refill, and then as things have started to dry up in the end of March and early April, it just drifted off the rule curve and started drafting pretty hard. We released just our minimum tributary flow at this project. We do not use this reservoir for providing flows for the main stem, so we've been just releasing the most minimum we can, and it's just not seeing the inflows that we would like. So we are definitely seeing a lower reservoir than we've seen in the last few years, including 2015. And it looks like we're going to continue to draft draft throughout the rest of the conservation season, just releasing those minimums. And most boat ramps the upper boat ramp does not look like it'll be available. Looks like we're already below it, and we'll just be relying on that low-level boat ramp at Cottage Grove. Next. And then DORENA, the same situation. You know, they're really close in the same basin, or nearby basin. It just drifted off the rule curve in the same period and has been kind of plateaued, and we're starting to see that draft as inflows are receding even more. We all are releasing minimums from DORENA. The minimum release requirement per the biological opinion does reduce, I believe, on June 1st. So we'll be reducing outflows, which is what's in this model run here. So it's showing that we will be drafting, continuing to draft as we meet those minimum flows. And here we do have the lower boat ramp elevation, the upper boat ramp elevation. It doesn't look like we're not going to reach it. So we'll be relying on that lower level at Baker Bay. Yeah, Fern Ridge. We even reduced outflows early on. We were right on rule curve, and things just dried up during around that same period, or even actually earlier in March, and it just kept drifting away from rule curve. So we're right there along. We're between the 2015 and 2020 water year. So yeah, last year was pretty bad, and we're kind of getting right there along that same trajectory as we saw last year. So I would expect something similar to what we saw last year as our forecast, which you can see on the right. Just looks like we're going to slowly be receding, and a lot of this will depend on the irrigation withdrawals and on the long tom. So we'll be monitoring that. if there's an increased amount of withdrawals, then we'll have to release more water. So I haven't heard anything that makes me concerned at this point. So we have a loss in some of the boat ramps because of the lower elevations, but we do have a couple boat ramps that should be available for the rest of the season. All right, COUGAR, so the Middle Fork projects are also heavily used for supporting the main stem flows. So this year, we did conserve that water by not releasing for augmentation during March and April and May. And so we have been able to refill quite a bit more than we would have if we would have had to do that augmentation. So it looks like we're going to be able to refill a little bit more, and then as that reservoir, or as we start having to release more to augment the main stem in June, we'll see the reservoir drop pretty heavily, and then we'll shift over to minimum flows because we only have so much storage. So this is an operation based on the benefits of that water being best to be used in June for in the main stem. And there is a potential that we will have to drop this reservoir further than what we're showing here, but that's part of the adaptive management, and that we'll be considering if conditions continue to be worse. COUGAR only has a higher level boat ramp at 1635, so once we start drafting the reservoir a little bit heavier, we will lose those boat ramps, and but access can still be made by foot. And then Blue River, it drifted off the roll curve around that same April time frame. At that same time, we did get the approval to not augment for the main stem, which allowed it to refill significantly more. So we're seeing conditions being better than 2015. Otherwise, we would have been worse off than we were in 2015. You can actually kind of see the little dip in early April. That's when we were actually started to augment, and we started seeing a big draft, and then we got the concurrent to not do that augmentation, which allowed a reservoir to refill. So I just want to say we had really great coordination to be able to conserve that water. But with that conservation, we need to use that water, and so then you see in June that big draft of water. We'll start picking up those releases to support the main stem fish migration and cooling temperatures, and then we'll start shifting back to minimum based on the amount of storage we have available and to get us through the season. And also Blue River mostly has higher level boat ramps, so we'll lose those boat ramps fairly early on. And then the South Santiam, Green Peter is one of those, the reservoir that if we do not completely fill, we have a hard time meeting our biop flow target. So we did conserve some water by reducing outflows during the incubation period. So, but we're still just not seeing the inflows that we need. So we started to see kind of a plateau over the last few months, doing better than 2015, but looks like we're kind of on the low end of the last few years. And you can actually see a lot of these years we've dipped below our minimum, the minimum conservation pool, where you can see these, Tom, if you start following those lines all the way down, and you can see those dips down in there. You can see that's us going into the power pool. So we've done it a few times in the last 2 years, and that's all I'm saying, that we might be doing that again this year. And so on the right-handed graph, you can see how we're looking at drafting that reservoir below that minimum conservation pool into that power pool. And that's just so that we can provide flows in the tributaries for ESA fish, species. So we have the one boat ramp, the Soul, that looks like it will be available. It's a low-level boat ramp, so we should have that available throughout the season. with Whitcomb being available for, looks like through some of June, but we'll lose that boat ramp as the reservoir starts to, maybe into July. So just make sure to check reservoir elevations prior to going out, because things will change. Like I said, we are continuously adapting our releases to meet the current forecast. All right, here we go into Detroit. Oh no, we're going in Foster. Sorry, I got too excited there. Foster is a re-regulation dam and a flood risk management dam, so it's got a smaller amount of storage than our other reservoirs. But we usually will refill that project and keep it full through the holidays. So Memorial Day, we're already up our maximum conservation pool, and we'll hold that typically past Labor Day. But this year, being a really difficult year and looking at all the possibilities within the South San Diego storage, there's a potential that we'll be dropping that reservoir right after Labor Day. And so that's what's modeled here. It's not a for certain thing, but there's like the possibility that we will have to drop that reservoir earlier. So we'll make sure that's communicated if that's the way to go. But just wanted to put that out there as that is a high likelihood that we will have to do that. Foster has a few different boat ramps, and since we do keep the pool up throughout the conservation season, all of those boat ramps should be available this summer. Next. All right, here's Detroit. Detroit is actually doing a lot better considering, compared to some of the other reservoirs. 2015, you can see on the left-hand graph that we barely even got, we didn't get very full. So we're doing a lot better than we did in 2015. But we're likely not to see much more refill than what we're already seeing right now. But the model does show just slightly more refill peaking in June. And just to reiterate, we are seeing that we will not reach that interim risk reduction measure elevation of 1558.5. So we are just likely to be shy of that elevation based on the hydrology of the basin. There are a lot of higher level boat ramps at Detroit, so we will likely lose access to those pretty early on. There is the Mongol boat ramps, the low level boat ramps that we expect to have open throughout the conservation season. We did reduce our outflows early on to improve refills. This provides us a benefit to do temperature operations. We start doing temperature operations for fish at elevation 1541, which is the spillway crest. So we were able to start those temperature operations, and we also have that additional storage that we're able to use later on in the season as the unregulated conditions get drier. I think that's it.
Selena, sorry I couldn't get off mute quickly enough. Boy, in the stat graphs, and I saw some questions in the chat. This is going to be recorded and made available, so folks will be able to go back and look at these a little more closely. The stat graphs really do show how difficult and different every year is, and I know that it's not uncommon when we have these meetings, especially in a dry year, the discussion around, is it time for us to change the rule curve and how we adapt to it. And that, one, I would like to emphasize how adaptive this really is, and I heard Selena say it several times. Early on, based on conditions, there was adaptation and an effort to store as much water as possible. But it is pretty clear over the last several years that we have seen some enormous extremes. Very dry years, very wet, high flow and high precipitation events that drove some flooding. And now we're also managing within very altered landscapes when it comes to runoff. And we're actively working to model the impacts of wildfire and what that means to downstream risk. Very complicated, and I'm not going to tell you today that there couldn't be an outcome that would mean our rule curves look differently, but there's an awful lot of adaptation that is currently going on in trying to not only manage risk, but also store as much water as possible for all of the reasons we just talked about. This is going to be a difficult year, and there are harder trade-offs ahead of us. What we haven't mentioned, is that we're already looking out into late summer, fall, and what it might mean if this dry, literally no precipitation in some cases trend continues for us. And, back in 2015, I think a number of you remember we talked about coming within a couple of days of getting so low at Detroit that we wouldn't have been able to generate hydropower. And so there are some unknowns going into the summer. Temperature will drive some decisions for us in terms of water releases and what we have to do for water quality downstream. And then what happens to us and how early precipitation shows up in the fall could lead to some hard decisions as well. But that will be something we continue to work with our partners and stakeholders on how to best balance the demands of the system and the realities that come to us. And we'll continue to communicate this flow information as we update it. I think, we haven't really come to an idea on how often to do this. As Selena mentioned, these things change fairly regularly. And I'm looking out the window a little bit while she's talking, and it's raining. Not the kind of rain that's going to help us, but it is raining. And so, we will develop a rhythm here to get updated information out on forecast, especially as we have to change some of our flow requirements because demands dictate that we do. I want to just one more time before we kind of open it up to questions, reemphasize, folks, be safe. And if you are a recreation provider or a user or somebody in a public position that can emphasize this, safety out on our reservoirs this summer, incredibly important to me and I think to everyone. It's going to be very different for folks out there this year. And I think this year, more than many in the past, folks are really going to want to get outside, right, and congregate together in places. And it's really frustrating to not be able to have a better forecast to provide those opportunities to folks. But we'll continue to update and manage within the constraints that we have and communicate along the way. So with that, Tom, I'm going to turn it back to you. I've been trying to track questions. I think we've had some folks, Kevin McAllister on our side of the house has been doing a nice job of answering questions as they came through. Anything we're missing out there, Tom?
Yeah, so I've been trying to capture some of these specifically, and I'm going to move ahead one slide for the Q&A session in the sense of just some helpful tips. And then I'll try to get back to my other screen with these questions, and maybe I'll do see that doing this particular way. But there are multiple questions about the rule curve, and one of the things that we are looking at as the core in the Willamette Valley EIS, that is part of what that team is looking at. Hopefully you can still see the question and answer slide since I moved this stuff around. So we're focused on operations that could impact the rule curve. So the rule curves could change if the operation is in the selected alternative and we get a change in authority from Congress is basically how that could work. But that's still being reviewed and worked on from the team from the Willamette Valley System Environmental Impact Statement. I don't know if that addresses this dynamic question that people had about the rule curve, other than slightly some of the slight operations that you mentioned about.
So, yeah, Tom, maybe what I say is this. think we have to be very careful about, how we talk about modifying the rule curve and the outcome of the EIS. Any change to our authorization is going to come with a lot of evaluation and some very careful study. The consequences, the risks downstream are significant, and they're increasing all the time. More people are moving in. We have changes to, the landscape due to fire. And I think we've had this conversation with a number of folks on the phone before. The outcome of a study on our rule curves could have a number of different end states, including a much more conservative approach to risk based on what we now understand about runoff and potential. So, yes, that is something that is and can be evaluated. I don't think that, it's going to be something that you see at the end of our EIS or that process, although future evaluation of that is a possible outcome. I know that's what people want to look at, and I understand the why. I think it's very difficult, though, when you look at really what's happened over the last couple of years. It isn't so much this consistent trend of drier, 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 drier. It is more extremes, right? We have really, really wet, intense periods, and forecasting is not at a point yet where we can really make these long-range projections. A comment I think I saw in the chat bar around Fern Ridge, and this idea of us perhaps retaining more water in January. Now, if you look at the conditions we had back in January, right, good snowpack across the basin, it had been wet. All the indicators in forecasting were that we were going to have a fairly good to a normal year. And what we know about Fern Ridge is that when we fill Fern Ridge, because of the constraints downstream, it's very, very hard. It takes a long time to discharge that stored water from Fern Ridge. So there's a big risk balance to be had there. In a year like this, where it pivots so dramatically, there really aren't a lot of choices or alternatives that we have in front of us. We did conserve water early on. We pinched flows at Fern Ridge very early on down to 30 CFS. But you've got folks downstream that are taking drinking water, from the Long Tom that are living next to the Long Tom. So again, these are all in balance, and I think that an adaptive approach is what we're taking, and continuing to stay open to the idea of more adaptation as, we have both the authority and the science to support those kinds of actions.
Dustin, and we'll add the Fern Ridge question asked about recent history of flooding, and 2019, if people are unfamiliar, had a lot of localized flooding in Eugene from a late storm, and you brought that up, and it was an April storm. So that is not just in the past. That was 2 years ago that happened. So another question that you brought this up at the end. I don't know how many other agencies are on that could request this or others, but with reservoirs like Detroit being critically low for safe recreation, we are seeing increased boater traffic on others like Fern Ridge. Will you help advocate for increased marine patrols on Fern Ridge to help manage the water boater behaviors? And I will say I have spoken with the public affairs side of the Marine of Oregon State Marine Board, and I have let them know that what the water year has looked like, but I haven't. That's just from my side to their side. Others might have different contexts there.
Recreation providers throughout the Willamette Valley have a really strong communication network, and whether it's Lane County or Lynn County or Marion County, those marine patrols are very dialed into both the use and the risks out there. So I don't know that advocating is necessary. They're so connected to this. It's going to be a very challenging year for them because it's not just the reservoirs, it's the river. And river levels being lower represent some different risks as well. So, yeah, I feel like we're in a really good spot with regards to law enforcement and marine patrols providing those services. There was another question out there about putting out additional markers and buoys. And what I'd say is that, from a practical standpoint, that is almost impossible to do. There are so many stumps in low water areas, the idea of going out and posting those outside of something that just is abnormal, like a big root water, something shows up in the center of the lake. is practically something the Marine Board doesn't do. I don't know if we have anybody on from the State Marine Board that's answering the questions in the chat. So what we do is post general warnings, encouraging folks to go out and really evaluate the areas that they're going to be in for hazards, because trying to post or buoy every individual hazard in 13 reservoirs and rivers across the state would be a very difficult task for the State Marine Board to handle.
All right, so I have a couple more questions coming in. We'll see if we can run through these. Any future plans for drawdowns in Cougar for a cooling tower fish collector replacement, and approximately how much of the lower Willamette Valley Project supplement, and I guess this is a separate question, how much of the lower Willamette Valley Project supplement Albany and Salem City water, and any anticipated changes to increase in outflows in the future? And if people can, there are some people responding in the chats from Corps staff, so some of your questions might be answered in there, so just monitor those as well.
Yeah, Selena, I don't know if you had any response to that question. I mean, there's nothing imminent from the standpoint of construction at Cougar. We are evaluating and we are waiting, and this is something we can't really comment on, the outcome of litigation that could represent some change to our operations, but I can't speculate on that at this point.
Sorry, I missed that. I was started reading a question from Bill. That. So
it was just about some stuff with Cougar, and like Dustin alluded to, there's a lot going on with that, but there's nothing imminent for Cougar for any fish collector replacement or temperature control specifically at this point.
Not at this point.
We already have that Cougar, so.
Yeah, it's all part of the EIS, all the work that's going on right now. So in the short term, we don't have any. There's nothing planned. I guess there's a lot of information here from Bill, but I think it's there's a lot that goes to our roll curve. The Willamette Basin being a rain-driven basin, we don't have a good way to know what months out are going to look like. We start refill February 1st. There's so much uncertainty between February and, say, May or June. We just don't know what we're going to see, and so that's why our reservoirs are low in February when we start our refill, so that when we have these April events, we have the storage to be able to manage. In April, we were low. And we actually worked on optimizing refill, and we got this flood event, and we saw record high elevations in our reservoirs, and we were pushing out quite a bit of water. Our primary purpose is flood risk management, and so we always have to keep that in mind when we're making these decisions. And during our refill, it's a balance, and it's a very challenging balance to get that refill, but also be able to have that flood storage. And we continuously are learning how to better forecast, working with our partner agencies like the River Forecast Center, part of the Weather Service. The Corps is looking at ways that we can use forecast-informed for doing forecast-informed reservoir operations. But the Willamette at this point is very complex, and we don't have a lot of the tools that are necessary. But we do look at how we can improve on our refill constantly. Every year we go into the refill season looking at ways that we can optimize our refill, and looking at what the current rule curve and what the current methodology is that we do. So.
And Tom, I know we're running short on time. I see a question from Bill Sweeney about infrastructure. And Bill, what I'd say is, and I know this has been an ongoing discussion with recreation providers, I do think that, you know, part of the answer is to try to find ways of improving the resilience or the usability of infrastructure over a range of, you know, wet years and dry years. And, you know, that's been a discussion at Detroit. That's part of the discussion in what the Recreation Master Plan development is at Green Peter with Lynn County. I'm sure that that's also going on at levels within the state at Fall Creek and Fern Ridge, et cetera. You know, that is a piece, and that is something that we can look at, and something that's, I guess, within our grasp to control. Most of the infrastructure that we have is built around, you know, consistently high pool elevations. And so it's a good point. I think it's the kind of thing that would provide some risk mitigation for these years where it's going to be unpredictably dry. And how do we do the best and provide the best opportunities to the public that we can over a range of conditions? So it's a good point.
All right, thanks, Dustin, Selena. Well, I'm going to try and capture some of these questions that are coming in still, and we still have some answers being responded to in the chat itself. But I'd like to thank everybody for attending. We had scheduled this for an hour. Our information, again, is still up on this slide, and please reach out to us, and I can put the public affairs in the chat email so that if you have questions you want answered, we can address them that way as well. So thank you, everybody, for attending.